Welcome to the first episode of the LiveOverflow IT Security podcast, focusing on IT security research and the researchers behind it. As you know, I have a YouTube channel where I make videos, for example, to show how binary exploitation works, buffer overflows, use after freeze, and so forth. And I think the video format works out quite well. And in the same way how I saw people looking for a really technical YouTube channel, I see people looking for technical podcasts. And there are some really nice security podcasts, but as a podcast listener myself, they were not quite what I was looking for. So I've been contemplating for a while now how I could make a useful technical podcast and record some tests myself, but I didn't really like it. But then Paul, a security researcher from the Moscow State University, wrote me an email with the subject, "Let's make a video." And he wanted to talk about how he and his friend Emil Lerner found several vulnerabilities in FFmpeg and how they exploited it. And this video will be coming, but we also had a really nice conversation just talking about the process of getting there. And while we were talking, I realized this is the kind of podcast I would listen to. So this is an experiment. First time doing something like this, it will likely evolve as I learn more about podcasting. So I'm really looking forward to feedback. Please write me an email to liveoverflow@gmail.com. So let's get started. FFmpeg is an open source project that creates libraries and tools to handle a huge amount of different multimedia files. For example, you can convert videos, extract JPEGs from videos, cut audio files, create a time lapse from pictures, and it supports many different file formats. FFmpeg is used by a lot of applications that do something with audio or video. And Paul and his friend Emil found several new vulnerabilities in it. But before we start how they did it, let's meet Paul first. He's a student at the Moscow State University, or maybe I should say he just got his bachelor's.
Just today, I have became a graduated bachelor.
And like me, he seems to be a student who gets really obsessed with something so much that he sits in class and wants to use the time to learn more about exploitation.
When I sit on the lections, I'm trying to do some binary exploitation challenges because I'm not that much interested in the materials and instead I'm trying to spend my time as much efficient as possible to get better at what I'm interested in.
So he clearly knows what he wants now, but that was not always the case.
So basically, I didn't know that I would be so much interested in binary exploitation even 2 years ago, because I started my path as web application hacker and I was very interested in it. I think 3 years ago, 3 years ago, I have joined the Bushwhacker CTF team at my university, and I was really happy with it because there was so much interesting stuff that was going on here. We did the CTFs, some our teachers were getting new courses at the university that were about the web hacking, but later I decided that I want to know everything about the information security. I want to know about the cryptography. I want to know about the binary exploitation, reverse engineering, and so on. So as I'm getting deeper and deeper at the reverse engineering and binary exploitation, I'm becoming more and more interested in it. And first I did it at some CTFs, just the binary exploitation, because motivation for me was that at the time our team was able to solve every web challenge that was on the CTFs, but we were not able to solve exploitation challenges, which makes us a little bit worse. But it's not so for now, because there are a lot of people that came to our security laboratory, came to our team, that do a lot of binary exploitation, and some of them are doing it even much, much better than me. And I still think that the CTFs are basically the good way to improve, the good point to start your way. And but this should not continue for long enough, because when you start doing binary exploitation in the CTFs, you have to show something to the world, that you're not just a CTF player. You have to show that you're a researcher, that you are doing it for something. So this was a good chance for me to show that the binary exploitation is working, the stack canary does not prevent all the bugs, all this kind of stuff. So I find that making a good research is actually my goal, like my life goal. So making the world more secure, finding more and more interesting bugs, improving in the real world binary exploitation. This is my life goal.
He has an interesting point here. So he used CTFs, security capture the flag competitions, to learn more about exploitation, and he also recommends it as a good starting point. But he also says that at some point you should move on to some real-world research, and this FFmpeg research was his way into the real world.
For me, this research was a chance to do something real for this world. I hope it worked out.
But why FFmpeg? I know it's a very complex software and it probably has still vulnerabilities, but a lot of research has been done on FFmpeg, and it sounds like a really scary beast.
Speaking about the target and how we managed to discover this one, Andreev from Mail.ru Corporation was first from us who managed to discover that FFmpeg is representing interest for a researcher. So he was working as a backend developer at that time at the cloud. So after noticing how many parts and how complex it is, how many web applications intending to use the FFmpeg as third-party software for processing the image and video on the server side, he just knew that it has to be goddamn vulnerable. And he was right, because it resulted that he found many vulnerabilities in FFmpeg, and they have suffered to do a giant update on this one. They were not like binary vulnerabilities, but they were logical ones. So for me and my friend Emil, it was a motivation to continue this research and maybe find new bugs, including the memory corruption bugs. I think this worked out because we found something new and we successfully exploited it.
Okay, so maybe FFmpeg still has some vulnerabilities, but was that just luck, or how do you approach this now?
As you know, the FFmpeg has many interesting parts, and the codecs were already so fuzzed for many CPU years by the researchers from Google, and I think they are continuing to fuzz it, and it might be not possible to find the vulnerability in the FFmpeg codecs. So Google started fuzzing FFmpeg like 3 years ago in 2014 or even earlier, when Jinveil Coldwind and Mateusz Jurczyk managed to discover like thousands of vulnerabilities using their own fuzzer.
So how do you deal with this fact? It sounds really hard to find more stuff.
When we have faced this problem, we decided that we could make two things about this. We could make fuzzing another way, and fuzzing where nobody has fuzzed FFmpeg ever. So we managed to do them both, and it's worked out because we found some new vulnerabilities that were not discovered.
Okay, so this makes sense. Fuzz a different part and fuzz it more intelligently. Realizing that sounds like a good motivation. It doesn't sound as daunting anymore.
Yeah. It was a kind of motivation to look in a different way in the FFmpeg. And we knew that we couldn't discover vulnerabilities in the codecs because they were so much fuzzed for many CPU years. But we really knew that there are some other interesting parts that they likely didn't manage to fuzz correctly, or maybe not even correctly, but they didn't manage to fully fuzz these parts. So we decided to look it up.
Now they have a rough plan. But how do you actually go about this? How do you find logic vulnerabilities? Do you have to read source code, and do you look at previous example vulnerabilities to get an idea of how they might look like?
Well, I'm not that good at discovering logic vulnerabilities in FFmpeg, but Emil did discover a lot of these vulnerabilities, and basically he have been reading a lot of source code, and he have been reading another researches on the FFmpeg vulnerabilities. There are not so many of them, but some that allowed him to understand the complexity of these vulnerabilities and where he could find them.
But Paul also mentioned fuzzing. But a lot of researchers have fuzzed FFmpeg before, so how do you identify what to fuzz?
Okay, so, well, we didn't know exactly which part we wanted to look up and analyze. So we decided that we are not going to look at the codecs, but we decided to look at the protocols that FFmpeg using to communicate with some other applications or maybe even users. So this quite managed to work out because the protocols inside FFmpeg were not fuzzed at all, and we even managed to discover some vulnerabilities just by looking into the source code.
Ah, protocols. So codecs are the part that basically implement the algorithms to, for example, handle the compressed audio or video file formats. But protocols are a different part of FFmpeg that communicates via network with something else. I imagine this could be something like streaming from a URL. You don't look at the decoding of the video stream, but generally how the transport protocol underneath is working. And you figured that out by reading code?
Yeah, well, basically we managed to read some parts of the source code, and it was quite enough for us to understand that reading the source code of codecs is not a very clever idea in terms of vulnerability discovery, and it was like very hard, and we have to look some other place, and we immediately found that the protocols is a good target. And on the next day we have already discovered some vulnerabilities in the format stuff and protocol stuff.
Okay, they found already issues just by looking at the source code of some of the protocols. I guess it's pretty clear that that is an area where fuzzing could yield a lot.
Yeah, we firstly we looked at the protocols, and then after that we tried to look into the vulnerabilities that were already discovered in this part, and we found a lot of CVEs and a lot of vulnerabilities that were discovered in other parts of FFmpeg, like codecs. We didn't manage to discover any vulnerabilities that connected with network usage or something like that.
So choosing the target, FFmpeg, and finding a part that was not yet extensively analyzed, the protocols, didn't seem like a big challenge.
Yeah, basically the real challenge was with fuzzing and the exploitation, because we didn't have too much of an issue with choosing our target. We just figured out that we found a part which was not very good analyzed in terms of vulnerability discovery, and we decided to get our hands on it.
Wow, okay, interesting. I would have thought that figuring out a good target is already pretty difficult, but I guess they did their research on old vulnerabilities really well, so they were confident that the protocols area is a good target. So how do you find old vulnerabilities? Did you just look up CVEs?
Yeah, the main source is, of course, the meter which is recording the CVEs. You could look it up and see the description of the vulnerabilities. And the second source that we used is actually the log of the GitHub, that you could actually look up one man in this GitHub using grep, and this is the only man in FFmpeg developer team who only thing that he is doing, he is reviewing the security patches and committing them. So you could just basically grab his name and find which issues FFmpeg had recently.
Huh, that is clever. Looking up this one developer who commits the security patches to figure out which areas got a lot of fixes. Let's quickly recap. FFmpeg is an interesting target because it's used by a lot of applications. Because of this, researchers have been looking and fuzzing FFmpeg for many years. Like Paul mentioned, the codecs were fuzzed extensively. But they figured out that another part, the network protocol implementations, were not fuzzed at all. And there were already some bugs they discovered by hand.
So basically, the Emil has already discovered one vulnerability in HTTP protocol by his own hands. What we wanted to do is to get the fuzzer working for all of the protocols. So we wanted it to be able to find the vulnerability what we have discovered by our own hands, and we wanted to make it find other vulnerabilities in the protocols.
This is good advice here. If you can find already a vulnerability, you can use it to verify that your fuzzer can find the kind of bugs you're looking for. So what kind of fuzzer did you use? AFL, American Fuzzy Lob, is a very popular choice nowadays, but does this make sense for networking? Because AFL only uses files as input.
Yeah. Basically, we have used AFL as the fuzzer because it is really clever, and it is a very interesting fuzzer which found already a lot of vulnerabilities, and I really admire Michael Zalewski for writing this. This is really a great idea on fuzzing. We used AFL, we overloaded the network operations inside the FFmpeg source code, and this helped us to discover some vulnerabilities. We managed to fuzz some protocols that were not previously fuzzed, and this is like, we fuzzed that in a unique way, and certainly we were certain that this part was not fuzzed by anybody else.
That's cool. I was wondering how you would fuzz all the different protocols. It seems tedious to implement that. But because AFL uses genetic algorithms to automatically discover and cover as many code paths as possible, AFL can automagically find how the protocol works. We have kind of seen that in a very popular article called Pulling JPEGs Out of Thin Air, where AFL fuzzed a JPEG library and automatically crafted valid image files with the complex file format.
Yeah, AFL could find automatically. The protocols are like really different, and we decided that we would do as good as possible examples, so the FL has some base to start fuzzing each protocol. So the vulnerability discovery was much faster because of this.
Because AFL is a genetic algorithm, you have to start somewhere, and so they gave AFL some example data how the protocol looks like, and with that AFL has a good start on discovering more code paths and get good coverage. But there is still one open question. How do you make AFL fuzz networking because it is a file-based fuzzer? Paul already used the word overloading for the network operations, so what does he mean by that?
Yeah, well, this is like very interesting question because, yeah, we did manage to fuzz it in some interesting way. There are very challenging tasks when you start fuzzing the network operations. And basically, like how FTP protocol works. Firstly, you communicate by FTP protocol with the server, and to actually transmit the file, it opens another port which you have to connect, and it will be translated over another TCP session. So this is like very interesting question how you are gonna to fuzz operations like this. But yeah, it was very simple for us, surprisingly simple, because we decided that we would overload the operations in the FFmpeg in some complex way, that it will partly until some marker it would actually read using the read or receive functions, and after marker it will be another read or receive session. So in this way you could add this marker into the AFL dictionary, and you could break the network communication into some like packets.
Oh, that's clever. So they basically implemented their own socket receive and send functions, and they would not actually do networking operations. Their code reads a big file at the beginning which contains markers to divide the one file in multiple receive chunks. So when FFmpeg calls the first receive, their code would return the data up to the first marker, and with the second receive they would provide the next chunk until the next marker. So that's really clever. This way you made the protocols fuzzable with files.
Yeah, well, so Basically, yeah, it's just overloading not just overloading, basically it was rewriting the read and receive functions so they would work with markers and emulating the blocking and non-blocking read. So this is a kind of new way in the emulating the network operations, yeah.
That's such a good idea. Is this something new you came up with, or did you hear about this from somewhere else?
No, we actually heard about the Prini, which is tool to the overloading the network operations, but we decided to write our own network operations overloader, and I think this works maybe a little bit better when the tool which guys from the Shellfish CTF team came up with. I think you could find actually this tool in their GitHub. So I think our approach maybe was a little bit better, just a little bit.
Let's do a quick recap. So you have a target and you know the interesting parts. Now you have to implement the fuzzing. They chose AFL because it's a really great fuzzer, but they had to add some modifications to FFmpeg in order to simulate network traffic through a file, because AFL uses files as input. And this file contained markers that divide one file into multiple networking operations. But when all of this is running, you should finally see some crashes coming in.
Yeah, looking into the crashes is really interesting because you have already found an segmentation fault, or maybe it is a crash which just corrupts the memory, and you managed to find that it corrupts the memory using the AddressSanitizer. Maybe this is the one thing we didn't mention in our talk about the fuzzing, that always use the AddressSanitizer, because even if you have the performance issues with that, like the program becomes 3 times slower if it runs with the AddressSanitizer. Still, you would discover more vulnerabilities than if you fuzzed just without AddressSanitizer looking for generic segmentation fault. So yeah, at this point we have discovered some crashes, and we were ready to look into them, but I think that this is not quite interesting, because when you have already discovered a crash, the main idea for you is just to understand why there is an ASON report or why there is a segmentation fault. It's not too much big of a deal, because it's kind of easy part to find in the bug in the source code when you have already a segmentation fault. For me, it's kind of easy part.
He mentioned something important here, ISAN, the AddressSanitizer. It's especially useful when looking for heap-based errors. You can imagine that when you have a slight out-of-bound read, you might just read a null, zeros in memory, and oftentimes there's code that checks for null, and nothing happens, no crash. But if there were values, if you specifically groom the heap so that there are values, it would crash. And AddressSanitizer helps you with that. It fills a lot of memory areas with different values and some other features to help you provoke segmentation faults and so forth. This way, it's easy to find issues that you might have not found before. And this instrumentation does slow down your execution, but like he says, it's really worth it. But I'm wondering, does this complex setup of modified FFmpeg code with your network overloading, AddressSanitizer, and AFL instrumentation lead to false positives?
All bugs we discovered using fuzzing were fully exploitable bugs and no false positives at all. Maybe there is able to find bugs that might not lead to the exploitation and code execution, but they're still bugs. Off by one on the heap maybe, which are not exploitable, but they're still bugs, and I have never seen that ASON would generate a false positive report.
Okay, that sounds really good. So now you have found actual crashes that could be exploitable.
We were quickly able to analyze them and to start analyzing how we would write an exploit for this one.
Now I would love to talk about the details of exploitation, but that actually doesn't make too much sense with only audio. Paul offered to walk me through the exploit and show me the interesting code parts, so we will make a video about that, so keep an eye out on the YouTube LiveOverflow channel. But before we finish this podcast, I completely forgot to ask, how many people were actually involved in this research?
In this particular research, there were 2 people, me and Emil. I was basically doing the binary exploitation and like bugs discovery. I have read like tons of FFmpeg code trying to discover some bugs. And Emil, he just can do everything. He is good at everything. He is good at finding logic bugs. He is good at fuzzing. He is good at exploiting bugs, and particularly in this research, there were just 2 of us, but globally we have maybe 4 or 5 members that from time to time do analyze the FFmpeg source code and try to bring some new bugs, because this is kind of interesting.
Do you have any advice for people who would like to get into research?
My recommendation is for you is doing everything on purpose, because it is so much important to know what you are doing this certain thing for, because later you would know that when it comes down to the CTF and research, you really have to know that it is improving you, it is accelerating you in terms of your education and knowledge. So do everything on purpose and you will find yourself very happy about your security stuff.
Thank you so much, Paul, and the others for sharing your research with us.
I would like to thank you for inviting me. Thank you for a good conversation. Finally, I was able to speak to somebody about the research we did.
Paul is really nice. He even thanks me for inviting him, but I should make it clear, all the gratitude belongs to him, because he is the one who reached out to me, so thank you for that. I also really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm looking forward to learn more about the exploitation details. This marks the end of the first LiveOverflow podcast episode. It was really interesting to me, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Like I said in the beginning, I would love to get some feedback on this episode at liveoverflow@gmail.com. Make sure to follow and subscribe on Twitter, Reddit or YouTube. Thanks! The music comes from Ozzed, OZZED.net. Thank you for making free music.
Subscribe to LiveOverflow YouTube channel.